Old School RuneScape has had a summer sweep up which has updated so much existing content, but today we're focused on one of the most divisive bosses in Old School RuneScape, Phosani's Nightmare. We're going to cover what's changed with this boss and if Phosani's Nightmare is finally in a place where it's worth doing on your account. What has changed with Phosani's Nightmare? First ones I want to mention are the changes that actually impact people learning Phosani's Nightmare more than anything else, which I think is really important for getting people into this boss. The first change is when you die, you actually go outside of the instance and you can collect your stuff right there, as opposed to being teleported back to Lumbridge. This is actually really good for learning, because learning Phosani's Nightmare is honestly a nightmare in and of itself. You will likely die multiple times before you start getting consistent at the boss, and by having your loot collected right outside of the boss, this is saving you a ton of time running back. Running back to the boss without a sleepy tablet, which you probably don't have at this point, takes you, a minute and a half or so to get there, provided you have the teleports. Now, you can instead just collect your stuff, bank, and go back to the boss. So you're cutting out an entire trip back to the boss every time you die, which is likely to happen a lot. Second thing is the sleepy tablet is now a 1 in 25 as opposed to a 1 in 100, and it's guaranteed at 25 KC instead of 100 KC. This is massive for getting into this boss because this tablet doesn't take you that long to get. I got pretty lucky, for example. I got it at, I think, 12 KC, but I would have been totally fine to go up to 25 KC to get this tablet. This tablet saves you well over a minute getting back to the boss. That makes the run to the boss about 30 seconds, a little bit less than that, which is a huge quality of life. And these two changes combined, in my opinion, definitely make Phosani's way more approachable if you're looking to actually learn this boss. The really big change to Phosani's Nightmare is the fact that they have removed phase 1 from the boss completely. If you weren't familiar with Phosani's Nightmare, the number of phases there were before was essentially 5. You had 3 phases that were identical in all ways except for the number of sleepwalkers at the end. Then you had a 4th phase that was basically the same but had some differences. You had to pray a little bit more effectively, the husks work a little bit differently, but by and large very similar. And then a desperation phase at the end, which is a pretty short phase and fairly chaotic. Now they've completely removed that first phase, so you instead now have 2 phases that are practically identical, other than one has 2 sleepwalkers, the other one has 3. Then you have that 3rd phase that's enhanced a little bit, and the desperation phase at the end. Before we get into how this change feels, I want to talk about how this impacts KC times, KC per hour, and of course, the amount of hours required for you to get a unique. Previously, we'll say the average KC time was about 8.5 minutes. Now it's about 6.5, 7 minutes. So it's, a minute and a half difference, which is very solid, of course. Now, this isn't taking into account banking. Banking is a static time. So if you're banking after every KC, if you think about the percentage reduction of the amount of time at Phosani's, it's not going to be as large because that banking time is static. So these following rates are going to take into account either if you're banking or not really banking too often. There's a bit of a variance between that. So previously you get maybe about 6 to 7 KC per hour, we'll say, depending on your gear and if you're banking whatnot. Now it's about 7 to 9 per hour, we'll say. 9 is probably closer to the high end. That's a fairly good increase. How does that actually increase how long it takes to get a unique though? Previously, the spectrum, let's say, was about 14 to 19 hours to get a unique, depending on your gear, your banking, etc. Now you're looking at about 12 to 16 hours. So, 2 to 3 hours quicker to get a unique on average. This means you're getting about a 15% buff to unique rates, maybe 20% if you're really pushing these changes very well. And that's a decent change, definitely a welcome change. But if we compare this to Project Rebalance, which just flat adjusted the rates, that was about a 40% increase. So compared to that, this is not really that big of a change. Changing the rates are going to be the more impactful thing always, I think, just because it's very easy to control. It's very easy to understand, where this change seems really large, but is actually much smaller in terms of unique rates. But it's not just about unique rates. Let's talk about how this change actually feels. And let's talk about this holistically as well, including the other changes. If you're an experienced player of Phosani's Nightmare, it's going to feel different than if you're new to Phosani's Nightmare, definitely. For experienced players, the sleepy tablet change obviously doesn't impact you because you already have it. The death changes might have a little bit of an impact, but you likely don't die as often, so you're not going to experience that as much. And even if you do die, having the sleepy tablet to get back is going to be a lot quicker. Where if you're a new player, obviously the death changes are incredible because they're going to prevent you running back to the boss when you likely don't have the sleepy tablet as well, which is going to save you a whole run back to the boss. Now, in terms of the phase changes, I think experienced players are going to really enjoy this. Cutting down the time for the fight by 1.5 minutes is going to feel very great. People are going to smash their PBs. I think somebody has a world record now of like 4 minutes, which is really good. For a new player such as myself at Phosani's, I still feel like the fight drags on a little too long. Like, in my opinion, 7.5 minutes is still a bit too long for a solo fight like this. I would personally think that this fight would feel very good at about 4 to 5 minutes, especially since like phase 1 and 2 now are identical. Like, they don't add anything, and phase 3 is almost identical to those, so it just feels a bit like a slog. If I had it my way though, I'd honestly remove another phase from this boss. I don't think you need the 3 phases that are almost identical into Desperation phase. I think you could just have 2 phases into Desperation phase. And at least those 2 phases will be slightly different. You won't have a repeat phase. This would make the kill times about 4 to 5.5 minutes, which I think is a little bit more closer to what I would find enjoyable. And entering that enraged phase more often is, I think, more fun, because that's kind of the best part of the fight, that very end. Now, this would improve the unique rates another like 15%-ish, but in my opinion, that's fine. I still think the unique rates could be buffed another like 20 to 30% anyways, and this would be a lever to potentially do that, and even removing another phase wouldn't be as impactful as some of the previous changes we've seen with the rebalance, the introduction of this boss, etc. Those were larger changes in terms of drop rates. This would just be a little complementary buff to those rates. If you didn't want to remove an entire phase again, you could just adjust some HP numbers here and there to lower the KC time a little bit, but I just think it was a little bit too repetitive having phase after phase. But this is just my opinion. Like, maybe you feel totally engaged, and there are different specials happening at different times, so it's not completely the same every single phase. There is one other major update that's happened recently that really improves Phosani's Nightmare, and due to the low popularity of Phosani's Nightmare, people sleep on it, pun intended. That is the introduction of double death charge. Death charge gives you 15% spec back when you take out an enemy. If you have double death charge, you could take out 2 enemies and get 30% spec back. This is such a huge upgrade for death charge. If you haven't done Yama, I highly recommend you go for it. But this is really good at Phosani's Nightmare because there's multiple opportunities to get double charges off. You can't always get double charges off. This definitely has cases where you can. The husks, especially if they happen early in the fight, that's 30% spec back right away. Sleepwalkers after every single phase, guaranteed 30% spec back right away. You're going to get so much extra spec from this that over the course of a fight, if you had Lightbearer, for example, you're doing 8 to 10 specs on the boss, which is so many specs. If you don't have Lightbearer, you're still going to spec a ton. Like, Altor is totally fine. In fact, it might be preference if you find Lightbearer to be a little too much regen. In terms of how much raw spec you're getting back, every single Sleepwalker phase is an extra 15% spec. So you got 3 of those phases, that's 45% extra spec. If it was down for this phase because you used it on Husk or something, so you already got your bonus 15%. If you use it on a Parasite, it's either going to get used on the Sleepwalker within a minute, or if it runs out, you're going to redo it and use it on Sleepwalker and get your bonus 15%. So in all those cases, it's 15% extra per phase. So 45% extra. Then there's some cases where husks happen early in the phase, and you can use it and have it up for Sleepwalkers, so you can have an extra 15%. So you're looking at anywhere from 45%, 60 being the most likely percentage, and 75% being the really high end. So you're looking at about a Void Waker and a bit, maybe Void Waker and a half if you're really lucky throughout the KC, which is very good. Heading into the last phase, you want 100% spec. This helps to make sure you get there. If you're down to like 60-70% spec, this can help get you there, which is very nice. In some cases, you might overkill that last phase. You might be already at like, 80% heading in the last phase, so you might not get the full value of double death charge. but that just means you got too much of a good thing happening. These are all W changes for Phosani's Nightmare, a huge step in the right direction, but it's amazing how many times we got to change the Nightmare and it still not be where it needs to be. I still think the fight could use some adjustment, but that's a little bit personal in my opinion. But the rates are still not where they need to be. I still think it's a little too rare for what you're getting and how difficult the fight is. I think Inquisitor's armor is not really where it needs to be. I think that could be reworked, like the stats on it can be reworked. So I wouldn't be surprised if we circle back on something Nightmare related in the future. So we'll see what Jagex will have up its sleeve then. But this is a boss I will start to add in my rotation when I'm feeling bored or I'm feeling up for it. But is this a boss you're going to do? Are you going to wait for more changes? Or are you an experienced player and how do you feel about these changes?